Welcome to the Infernal Brotherhood's Willow series. Today I'm beginning my live reading of Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas, Book 1 of the Willow sequel trilogy, Chronicles of the Shadow War. We'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel for more Willow content and like and share this video. Shadow Moon, first in the Chronicles of the Shadow War. George Lucas and Chris Claremont. For fans of fantasy everywhere. GL. To Eleanor, Betsy, Lucy, and Tom, for faith, trust, patience, and skill. CC. Prologue. In the middle of the night, Willow Ufgood rode the back of a dragon. It was a dream. Had to be. He'd gone to bed quite a bit later than usual, after a hard day in the fields. Spring had come late this year, the weather changeable as the courtesan's costume. When it finally broke, he and the other farmers of the vale had to hurry with their plows to turn the ground and ready it for planting. He was out the door every morning before sunrise, and didn't quit until the night grew too dark to see, sowing seeds of wheat and corn and barley, and then checking the condition of the modest orchard of apple trees arrayed in double row up from the river to form one border of his holding. At the same time, Kaya was busy with her kitchen garden closed behind the house, with the herbs and vegetables that would not only grace their own table, but bring welcome income at Saturday market. The whole family pitched in to help, but the children were still too young to handle stock, and as it was Kaya's special gift to charm the green growing things of the earth, so was it Willow's to speak to the animals that walked upon it. Occasionally, though, he considered that a mixed blessing, as with today, with his pig decided to behave like a pig and take it into its head that plowing was beneath its station. He couldn't force the beast. It stood as tall as he and outweighed him by more than he cared to think about, which meant he had to resort to persuasion. The pig, of course, chose to hear nothing that was said to it until it was good and ready, preferring to bask in the sunlight and enjoy a day that felt more like midsummer than spring. Willow wanted to strangle the beast. He thought of glazed ham and pork roasts, and chops and bacon. Oh, how he loved bacon. But he knew the pig wouldn't take the threat seriously. It was far more valuable to the farm in its present occupation and as breeding stock. In that moment, and only for the moment, the world seemed to shift ever so slightly, turning back on itself the whole year. Same field, same situation, though the pig then wasn't acting nearly so pig-headed. Willow tilling his soil as his father had done and his father before him, and so on back as far as memory went in Nelwyn Vale, distracted suddenly by the cries of his children that they'd found a baby in the bulrushes. Such an ordinary day it had been, yet from that point of his life was forever changed, and the fate of the world in the bargain. That day he'd rescued the sacred Princess Elora Danan. He found himself walking to the river, crouched by the spot where he'd drawn her ashore. There was a peaceful stillness to the water and air that allowed him the full use of his senses, as though every sight and sound and scent stood as an individual, in stark and absolute contrast to its background, rather than being mixed together in a cacophonous blend, as was normally the case. Honeysuckle was sweet, almost cloying, until it gave way to the more delicate fragrance of Kaya's rose bushes, winding their madcap, helter-skelter way up and over her harbor. He heard the whine of a mosquito, the deeper buzz of the fat-bottomed bee, the zizzing of a clutch of cicadas building into a crescendo and fading away, the trill and squawk and whistle of a myriad of birds. He saw a widening circle of ripples marrying the perfect plane of the river as a fish quickly broke the surface to claim the life of an unwary bug. He beheld the pattern and order of life in all its forms around him, and thought how a year ago that sight would have left him content. It still brought joy, but contentment was a word with an edge that, while it had yet to draw blood, still pressed him deeply enough to make itself felt. The pig was up when he returned to the field, shifting impatiently from one foot to the other and glaring at him accusingly as though it were Willow's fault this task wasn't being properly accomplished. After supper, when the children were safely tucked to bed, he retired to his workshop off the back of the house proper, half sunk into the ground so that he had to descend a small stairway from the washroom. Originally, it was where he stored his tools and made whatever was needed in the way of furniture for the house. Now, in addition, it was where he practiced his magic. The walls were slabstone, like the house, which gave the whole structure the sense that it was an extension of the natural landscape, rather than something that had been built. There was a hearth in the far corner for warmth as well as to heat his various concoctions. He had a comfy chair to relax in the occasion when his castings left him too weary to manage the climb to the main floor, and a wooden stool by his workbench. Windows for light by day, candle sconces for night. The floor itself was bare, unlike the polished wood planking of the rest of the house, because, regardless of the season, he preferred working barefoot, drawing comfort and no little strength from the raw, rich earth beneath his toes. On the table was the gift he'd been making for the princess. It was a stuffed bear, a larger version of the ones he'd made for his own children when they were her age. Its fur was golden to match her hair, short and thick like a tabby cat's and plush enough for a girl to sink her face into. The arms and legs and head swiveled so that if Elora hugged the bear, it would feel as though the bear was hugging her back. As he'd known from the start, the face had been the main challenge. He sat in his plush overstuffed armchair and stared, savoring the mug of cider Kaya had poured for him, and the bear stared back. More than once over the weeks, Willow had been prepared to swear the bear's expression changed. The eyes were polished crystal that he'd quarried himself. He'd meant them to be green, to match Elora's, yet in place they appeared a rich hazel, like a finely aged wood, the same as his own. The mouth would seem serious one glance, then take on a wryly humorous cast with another. The bear had actually been finished the better part of a fortnight, time enough for even a Nelwyn messenger to carry it to Elora's home, the fabled Daikini fortress of Tirasleen. Willow's intent had been to present it himself, but nature had little interest in such human desires or the plans that went with them. The time he'd been away would cost him the better part of the year's crops, and that was a loss his family could ill afford. He sent apologies and regrets as soon as the weather's perversities became clear. The bear should have gone with them. Yet here it was, sitting on his table. He sipped his cider, thinking how quickly it had grown cold, never considering that the cause of the chill might be the length of time he'd been sitting there, and turning his gaze to the hands that held the mug. A year ago they'd been farmer's hands, and he'd been a proper Nelwyn, with improper dreams of becoming a sorcerer's apprentice. Now he was a wizard, true, and felt the power crackle within him at every beat of his heart. It was part of the fabric of his being. It reached through him and from him to everything he touched. "Some power," he muttered in asperity. "Some wizard who can't even persuade a pig to pull a plough." He rose to the table as he spoke, reaching out a finger to gently trace a line from the center of the bear's forehead, down between its eyes and over the tip of its nose of black thread to finally tap it oh so gently on its chest, right over its heart. The stuffed animal wasn't alive, yet he felt from it a sense of being, as though the act of physical creation had imbued it with a minute portion of Willow's own spirit. "Watch over her, little bear," he said. "Keep her safe, always." He took care not to wake Kaya as he snugged his way gently beneath the sheets. There was a fresh scent of flowers and sunlight to the cotton, hardly a surprise since he'd watched them billow in the afternoon breeze as she hung them out to dry. She stirred anyway, sleepily murmuring his name, and to make up for disturbing her, he gently scratched her back along the length of her shoulder blade. She immediately rolled to her stomach, flexing along the full length of her like a cat at an invitation to continue, and so he did, stroking the tips of his nails from the top to the bottom of her spine while she smiled and purred in delight. He drew her to him, one kiss leading to another, returning his caresses with her own, and passion quickly claimed them both. Afterward, he thought it would be a long time before sleep claimed him. He never felt so alert and wide awake, but the moment he stretched himself flat, he found himself yawning, fatigue sweeping like a sunset across the back and shoulders. He beat his pillow into its proper shape and rolled over onto his side to behold the whole wide world far, far below. He cried out. The dragon laughed. A louder shout burst from him, heart trip timing in his chest more sharply than a quartermaster's drum beating the call to arms. He was nestled in the hollow of a set of shoulders so broad they easily would have fit his entire farm, staring up a neck that all alone topped the tallest tree he'd ever seen. He didn't want to think how far the creature stretched in the other direction. Great wings reached out from where he stood, beating only occasionally as the dragon rode the evening thermals, letting wind and air do most of the work of keeping it aloft. The ground below was already cast in shades of velvet, dusk having mostly turned to full night, but the dragon soared high enough to catch the last rays of the sun as it dropped beyond world's end, casting diamond sparkles off the surface of the sunset ocean. In spite of himself, Willow pushed to knees, then feet, taking hold of one of the double row of dorsal spines, most resembling maple leaves in shape, that ran the length of the dragon's back from skull to tail. At this juncture, they stood easily twice the height of a tall daikini, which made them nearly 4 times his own, and he couldn't help marveling at the scale. He knew houses in his village where a single segment would have served as a good-sized wall. The only reason he didn't number among them was that he'd expanded it to a second story when the children grew old enough for rooms of their own. The dragon's line of flight put this side of the dorsal in sunlight, and even that faint and fading radiance he saw was enough to put the outline of body and wings in continuous flashes of crystalline fire, as though the dragon was formed of the same golden glowing substance as the sun itself. It was a beauty, so wild, so elemental it made him ache. No less wondrous was the world through which they flew. Normally, heights terrified him. His wife was far better on ladders than he. Here, though, he felt no fear, and decided that was probably because it was so far to fall. His mind simply refused to comprehend. Or, better yet, since this was a dream, had to be a dream, he told himself, there was nothing in it that could truly do him harm. So why not simply stop fretting and enjoy both flight and view? "Why not, indeed?" the dragon said companionably. "You can talk, but you can't fly, so I figure I'm ahead of the game." It was a pleasant voice, with a baritone's hearty resonance, the kind he'd expected to hear at the Ram's Horn Inn telling stories before the blazing hearth fire. The dragon had turned its head all the way around to look at him, with the same discontentingly boneless ease of a swan. "You knew what I was thinking," Willow protested. "Think more quietly, then. I'll wager there isn't a creature within mind-sight of your dwelling, Nelwyn, doesn't know your every secret." Willow flushed furiously as scarlet at the sunset sky. "No one ever told me." "Did you ever ask?" "Why should I have? It never occurred to me that my thoughts could be heard by any but me." "Sorcerers." The dragon sighed with a bemused dismay that was altogether genuine. "The power to shape worlds, and not the slightest sense in some of them how to use it." "I've been learning." Another protest. "Parlor tricks. As you are more sensitive to the world, little Magus, so is the world more sensitive to you. You took up the sword fate offered. You must measure yourself against all those who do the same." Willow was about to ask what that meant when he caught sight of a layer of clouds ahead and gasped with the realization of the dragon's headlong speed through the air. An eye blink later, he found himself passing through the heart of them. There was an instant's darkness and chill, as though he'd suddenly been immersed in fog, and then they were once more in free and open air. "I thought there'd be more to it," he mused aloud in wonderment. "Cloud, you mean?" "Nope," said the great head, shook back and forth. "What you see is both less and more than what you get." "I'm Denier," the dragon said. "Callan Denier." "Willow Ufgood," said the Nelwyn's reply, as the dragon offered a wry grin with his surprise mobile mouth that revealed fangs far longer than Willow was tall. "Savior of Elora Danan, slayer of demon witch Queen Bavmorda. You've quite a reputation." "This is lunacy," was all Willow could find to say to that.
"Or a most spectacular dream,"
the dragon chuckled. "The sun hasn't set." There was amazement in that small man's tone.
"Oh?"
"We've been flying all this while, and the sun's no lower in the west than when we started. Have you somehow magic time to stop?"
"Neat trick, but also one that shouldn't be indulged in often. Time is like a great river. The more you try to manipulate it, the greater the consequences, and they're not always the ones you expect."
"Oh," Willow replied, as though he understood, when in fact he hadn't a clue what the dragon was talking about.
"We fly at the pace the world turns, which means our position relative to the sun remains constant. If I go slower, it will drop below the horizon. Faster, it will appear to rise."
"And when you come to the end of the world, what then?"
"The world has no end, Nelwyn."
"You lie!"
"Look about you. What do you see?"
"Water." He clutched the nearest spine and looked about for a gap he might squeeze through to place himself safely between the line of double dorsals and thereby block out the view. "What have you done with the land, monster?"
"Look to the edge of what you can see, Willow. How do things appear? Or are you too afraid to try?"
He took a brave stance. No giant lizard was going to shame him. The dragon's chuckle on hearing this wayward thought only making Willow all the more determined, and ruthlessly quelled the trembling in his voice when he replied. "The horizon. It's," he thought for a moment, "curved."
"What's a curve that goes right the way around?"
"A circle."
"And an object made up of nothing but circles?"
"A ball."
"Enlarge. But any other name? A world."
Try as he might, Willow couldn't comprehend the difference right away, and the effort stole the strength from his legs, dropping him to the seat, with his back against the dorsal spine, slack-jawed with astonishment and no little awe.
"You need not take my word for it," Denier chuckled. "Mathematics will provide you proof."
"That's tall-folk knowledge," Willow told him. "We Nelwyns have our own way, with little use for Daikini numbers."
"It's there regardless."
"Where does it go, Denier, this water?"
"To another land. Only this is called the Sunset Sea, and beyond that land another ocean, and so on, until at last we come back to where we started."
"Are there people?"
"Domains there, as here. All the realms of the Veil folk, plus what you would call Daikini in their mad variety. Kingdoms galore, the greatest being Angwin, which is as far from your home, young magus, as it's possible to go."
"I wish we could," he thought, with a yearning that poked him as sharply as any knife point. If the dragon heard, he gave no sign. "Did Bavmorda know?" he asked instead. "Of these other lands?"
"A magus, a true sorcerer of true power, is driven to know all there is to know. From that quest comes power. There are worlds within and worlds beyond, Willow. What you behold with your 5 physical senses is but one among a multitude."
"Can't I be satisfied with that?"
"If you were, you wouldn't be here."
Denier had altered course along the way. Belatedly, Willow realized the sky had darkened from the pale blue of day to the rich cobalt of twilight, and lastly to the diamond-laced velvet of full night. The dragon's skin radiated a welcome warmth, but there was still sufficient chill for their headlong passage through the sky to allow him the sight of his every breath. He was thankful that the bulk of the dragon's body blocked the wind of its flight from reaching him. He had no decent handholds beyond those of its spinal ridge, and sensed rightly he'd be as helpless as a leaf in the hurricane. He didn't like the road those thoughts were taking, and to cast them loose, Willow turned his eyes upward through the air to clear his so clear he imagined he could see every individual flash of brilliance from each of the stars above. He never given them any serious thought before. They appeared every night, so constant in shape and position that made the perfect guide for travelers, which in turn made him consider how a bright lamp, when brought close to the eyes, tended to wash away all sight of whatever lay behind it. "They're always there, aren't they?" he asked. "The stars, I mean. Day or night? If the world is a ball floating in the sky, then why not the moon, and the sun as well? And if they're balls, what of all those little lights beyond? Are they balls too? Are they small because they're small, or because they're far away? If the world doesn't end, what of the sky around it? How far does it go? How much space is there? It was more revelation than he could handle. It left him trembling with the awful sweep required of his imagination. His was a reality where the average tree was monstrous huge. Celestial proportions had no real meaning to him. Ice gripped him, heart and soul, a terror as sudden and all-consuming as the fear of his family's death. Why aren't we falling?
There's no need to fear, Willow, the dragon told him. The mother world won't let you go.
Balls don't hang in the air. You throw them up and they fall, he cried, as close to panic as a fresh recruit in the face of his first battle. His hands closed convulsively on the edge of the nearest dorsal in a desperate, reflexive bid to hold on.
Then don't look. Don't think about it. Be a farmer. Be an Elwyn.
Willow felt a flash of anger. There's no shame in either. The dragon shrugged, the flex of its shoulders feeling more to Willow like a minor earthquake. Why did you tell me these things? There was a roughness in his voice as his fury began to turn from wayward sparks to a sustained blaze. What do they have to do with me?
You're a wizard,
was the reply, as if the answer was altogether obvious. Willow was panting, flushed within, soaked without by sweat. His rage had been like a fever of such intensity that it consumed itself even as it tried to do the same to him. With a conscious effort of will, he forced his fingers to open. They were white and swollen from the force he'd exerted on the dorsal, and he hoped he hadn't hurt the dragon in the process. He looked about himself, taking in the dragon, the night, the world. We're not falling, he said in wonderment. Nothing had changed, and everything.
It's all a matter of perception, really,
Denier noted, tone as casually dry as any academic's.
A ball in the air will fall. The same ball in water might float. Who knows for truth what medium the world passes through? We may well be falling, all of us together.
Denier's mouth creased into a grin.
But who's to know until we hit something?
I feel comforted already.
To an ant, Nelwyns are giants. To Nelwyn, Daikini are. Everyone has their place in this scheme of things, and all prefer to view that place as being the center of the universe.
Including dragons?
But of course, my friend, save that we know we're the center about which all revolve.
A rare wit. I'm laughing inside.
You're learning, young Magus. Give as you get, as good as you get.
Among the Nelwyns, the rule is to give as you would be given. There's a difference.
The two aren't incompatible or mutually exclusive. Situations defines response.
Outstanding. Am I so exhausted in mind and spirit that the best my dreams can offer is a dialogue in philosophy?
Not what you expect from a farmer or a Nelwyn, is it? I am both lizard.
And more?
Why am I here?
Interesting question, considering where we are. The bulk of the dragon's body obscured any view of the ground directly below, and Willow had no intention of making his way to where the curve of its rib cage turned downward for a better sight. Instead, he picked his careful way along the dorsal ridge, soon finding an opening large enough to allow him to wriggle through and continue on between the double line of spinal plates, up the shallow curve of the neck until he reached Denier's head. He leaned against a brow ridge that curled back from the dragon's right eye to form a many-spiked crest that peaked above and behind its skull. He didn't understand how so huge a creature could remain aloft. The head alone would fill the entire market square of his village, and he suspected that the dragon's entire would dwarf Tirasleen. There was precious little ambient light, since the moon had yet to rise, but it wasn't needed. One of the first side effects of his wizardry was a heightened sensitivity of his physical being. He could overhear a cat, outscent a hunting hound, and his sight had no peer. Mage sight, he called it, allowing him the full range of vision even in pitch darkness. At first, nothing looked familiar. "Is that a sunrise?" he asked himself in a tone as wry as the dragon's. "By the way, when was it you last saw the world from such a view?" A serried line of mountains, saw-toothed and jagged like the mouth of a shark, building to an ugly hollow of an ancient volcano, which in turn gave way to an ugly valley below. Willow didn't need mage sight or a second glance to tell him what stood at the head of that valley, dominating the highlands with easy access to the plains beyond. "Nockmaar," he said in recognition of that damned fortress, his voice a rasp. "Bavmorda's dead," he continued, "consigned to the doom she planned for Elora Danan."
"You should know."
"I was there, Danir. I saw it." A pause. "Are you trying to tell me different?"
"There are 12 great domains," the dragon said, "as much of the spirit as of the flesh. Elora Danan is the 13th that binds them all."
"I never understood how or why of that. What makes her so special?"
"Perhaps it's time you started learning."
"Is something wrong, Danir? Is there some danger?" There was a rush of wind, exceptionally gentle, considering the tremendous size of the creature that generated it, as Danir bellied his wings and extended his hind legs for landing. Willow saw they were in a different valley on a land of rolling hills, where the peaks of the Nockmaar range were reduced to bumps along a distant skyline. Where the dominant color of one was a dank slate, here was a riot of earth tones, rich greens and browns. Nockmaar stone was leached of life, the granite of Tirasleen, fair, burst within. Willow assumed the dragon had cast some sort of glamour over the castle to mask its presence. He had no other explanation, save the rankest incompetence, which he prayed was unlikely, for the failure of any sentries to sound an alarm as the head arced delicately forward to rest on the topmost battlements. The hint was unmistakable, and Willow wasted no time clambering up from his perch. He stumbled on landing and had to take a breath to gather his legs and wits beneath him. "I'll ask again, Danir," he said as he straightened, "and I'll demand an answer. Is there some He was speaking to darkness and open sky. The beast was gone, as if it had never been. An appropriate profanity made it as far as thought, though not to execution, before being derailed by the clash of steel from beyond the nearest corner tower and a level below. There were torches everywhere along the parapet and walls, arrayed at intervals on poles across the courtyards below, illuminating the bailey to a fair semblance of daylight. There was a day's worth of activity as well, a tumult of people and animals, carts and their cargo, scurrying purposefully to complete the preparations for their upcoming days of celebration. The din was awful, voices of all shapes and descriptions, human and otherwise, trying to make themselves heard over the clash of hooves on cobblestones, the crunch of crates striking the ground, hammers on anvils. They competed in turn with a valiant band of musicians off in a corner, facing a clear space whereupon couples were merrily dancing and flanking on either side by plank tables on which were laid buckets of ale and rough red wine and trenches of bread and meats and sweets, catering to the entire assemblage. It didn't matter whether folk were noble or common, secular or clergy. For this one special night, all the arbitrary distinctions of society had been suspended, allowing people to treat one another solely as people, and everyone was making the merry most of it. To Willow, though, it was as if all the noises he'd ever heard, up to and including the one great battle he'd fought in, had been poured into the confines of these walls, which served them to magnify it tenfold. It was a wonder anyone present could make the thoughts heard, much less their voices. Yet once more came to him that still, pure tang of blade on blade, sharp and staccato, a summons as peremptory as any monarch's, and as impossible to refuse. He took stock of himself as he hurried along, mindful that, dream or no, he wanted to look his best. He donned his nightshirt before bed, but that was long gone, replaced by boots and breeches, a light woolen shirt, a leather overshirt that was as much a jacket, belt around the middle, traveling pouches at his side. He was dressed for a journey. In height, like all Nelwyns, he wasn't much to speak of, standing barely as tall as a Daikini man's hip, the length of his body concentrated more on his torso than in his legs, which gave him a surprising reservoir of strength, but made walking a trial. His hair was shoulder-length and full, mahogany brown at first glance, but shot through with streaks of fiery russet that manifested themselves in the right light. He never considered himself particularly handsome, no matter how often Kaya told him differently, or particularly quick or intelligent or brave, even though in truth he was all these things and more. What he saw in his mirror was a plain man, whose goal was to do honorably and right by himself, his family, his friends. That was what he offered the world, and all he asked of it in return. If he thought of himself as molasses, then the fishers dueling along the parapet were wildest quicksilver. One was dark, the other fire. Both Daikini, a man and a woman, lithe and lean with the bodies of trained warriors and the moves to match. The man stood a head taller, but the difference offered no advantage. The woman wore black wool and cotton and leather and mail, as though ready to ride to battle. The only spot of color about her was her hair. It was the red of fallen leaves, the dusky rose of simmering coals, making her face appear all the more pale by contrast. The man's hair appeared black, though Willow knew it was laced with dark brown, the tan of his features complemented by the rich colors of his clothes. He'd contemplated no war in his future when getting dressed. That much was obvious. His fur-trimmed boots were more appropriate to the royal court, splendid for the dance, useless on campaign, and his pants were cut more to show the elegant shape of his leg than for actual comfort. His shirt was a bell-sleeved cotton so fine it most resembled silk, and the exertion of the duel had opened its laces to expose a fair, broad, expansive chest. Over that had gone a sleeveless waistcoat. No doubt there'd been a doublet. That was the fashion of the season, so Willow had been told when adamantly refusing a similar suit for himself, long since cast aside to allow for more freedom of movement. Swords clashed high, low. Then the woman lunged to full extension, apparently intending to impale her foe through the heart. Only that heart wasn't there to receive the fatal blow. The man spun away from her attack, making a full revolution down the length of her arm to stand behind her. As he went, he caught hold of her wrist in his free hand. He lifted it and her sword and twisted to force her against him. Then his other hand, which held his sword, pulled tight to the small of her back, and he moved the pair of them as one along the length of the parapet, in perfect timing to the music from the castle main yard below. He offered a smile. She kicked him in the knee. "Sorsha!" he cried, more in dismay than pain. "Madmartigan!" she mocked in return, matching his tone and coming from him once more with her blade. He hopped clear as best he could, but swords moving too fast to follow his every attack, his to hers as much as the reverse met its parry. Willow dropped to a seat where he stood. He had a splendid vantage point and enjoyed the show. He never met a more devout couple, or one more likely, at any time, for the most absurdly trivial of reasons, to kill each other. "It's a night of celebration, woman," Madmartigan insisted in asperity. "Well, I'm certainly having a wonderful time." "Where were you raised?" "You know damn well where, and by whom." "You're a princess, damn it! Try acting the part! I'm supposed to be the rogue here." "Oh," she said, and it was immediately clear Madmartigan had said exactly the wrong thing, because she redoubled her already considerable efforts, forcing him to drop his irreverent mask for a time and concentrate on swordplay. "I see," she continued, speaking the same staccato rhythm formed by the impact of their blades. You get to carouse. You get the comfy clothes. You get all the fun, while I wave sweetly from my window. I don't think so." "It won't break your soul to set aside your sword for an evening and take up dancing instead?" To emphasize the point, he somehow slipped around her guard again. Willow was looking for the move, watching with all his formidable concentration, and still couldn't tell how the man accomplished it. All Sorsha could do was fume and follow as he led her gracefully across the stone in a way Willow had never seen before. She cocked him solidly with her sword hilt, and when he cried out, clutched reflexively at himself, she tripped his legs out from under him. Before the rump struck stone, she was away with the merriest of laughs, daring him to follow her up a flight of stairs and around the corner of the battlements. He cast about, seemingly in confusion, as if unsure of which way to go. A moment later, he launched himself into the air, describing a great arc across the bailey at the end of the halyard normally used for lifting armaments to the top of the wall. His plan was to swing ahead of her and be waiting when she emerged, hopefully winded from the corner tower. Unfortunately, he chose to land right where Willow was sitting. It was a most impressive collision, despite the Nelwyn's last ditch and frantic attempts to scramble clear. "Damn you, Nelwyn!" he heard as they untangled themselves through the affection of the Daikini's voice belied the profanity he used. "What god did your kind annoy when they were handing out sizes, huh? Too small to notice, too bloody big to avoid." "I'm pleased to see you too, Madmartigan," he grumbled in reply. Sorcia's contribution to the conversation was a delighted bubble of laughter, occasioned by her holding a pair of swords, hers and her husband's, crossed at Madmartigan's throat. He was sprawled amidst a jumble of collapsed crates, legs outstretched and splayed apart, while she straddled his hips, perfectly balancing on the balls of her feet. A twitch of her wrists would be all that was required to finish him. "No fair," Madmartigan protested. "I cry interference." "Nice try," was her response. "Better you should watch where you're going. I certainly did." "Did you see what I'm supposed to see in here?" Madmartigan asked Willow with an exaggerated roll of the eyes. "Your equal?" "Not tonight, my little friend," Sorcia smiled. The swords stayed where they were. Madmartigan crossed his ankles beneath her, his hands behind his head, looking like a man without a care in the world. "I yield," he told her. "Now may we dance?" Carefully, for the blades were honed more keenly than any razor, Sorcia set aside the weapons, rolling forward to her knees in the same motion so that her face was above Madmartigan's. Willow looked away and didn't remind them of his presence with a discreet cough until their second kiss. "What was that all about?" Willow wondered aloud as the three of them made their meandering way along the parapet to a bridge connecting it with the inner keep. "All work and no play," Madmartigan began, but was as quickly cut off by Sorcia, whose tone, this was evidently an old argument between them, made Willow fear the duel would start up all over again. "I'm a warrior, Madmartigan. Why is that so hard for you to accept?" Sorcia took a hefty swallow of wine from a skin Madmartigan had produced and passed it along to Willow. "And what am I? But there's more to life. There should be more to our lives." "I hate the way the king's household looks at me. They want to make me something I'm not and resent me for resisting." "Can't you find a middle ground? I think you look lovely in a gown." "Funny, based on our first meeting, I thought much the same of you." The wine was a rough red, tasteful but merciless, especially when it went down the wrong way. Willow coughed and choked and nearly drowned at the memory of the wild afternoon and Madmartigan's impromptu disguise at the village wench. He almost got away with it too, until one of the soldiery made an impromptu advance. Tactfully, Madmartigan chose to change the subject. "I thought you weren't coming," he said to Willow. "I'm not coming. I'm not here." The two Daikini exchanged deadpan looks, choosing to take the Nelwyn at his word. "But I will stay. I can't remember when I've had a more wild dream." "How'd you make the trip?" "On the back of a dragon." "Sounds like a dream to me." Sorcia smiled, only to burst into a riotous set of giggles as Madmartigan swept her into his arms and down a flight of steps in another impromptu pirouette. This time she didn't hit him or push him away, but tried to match herself to the melodies of the fiddles, Ulian pipes, and tiampan gaily holding forth below. "I'll wear a gown tonight, if you do the same tomorrow," she challenged. He considered. Scandalous thought. Only men are supposed to show the shape of their legs. "Probably because they're afraid of the competition." "I don't understand you Daikinis," Willow grumbled aloud, because for the most part he truly didn't. "Sorcia wears pants every time she rides to battle. The shape of her legs are plain for all the world to see. What's the blessed scandal?" "That's practicality, Willow," Madmartigan explained. "Wearing trousers in a fight. She's a warrior, not a woman." "At last he comprehends," she applauded. "But at court, at a ball, I suppose you could say it's a whole different kind of battle, with its own set of rules. Men play peacock and display their charms for their ladies. Women, Words failed him, which was a rarity. Men choose, women are chosen. That's a polite way of putting it, Sorcia finished for him, making plain her dissatisfaction with such an arrangement. In Tirisleen, my sweet, a courteous guest lives by Tirisleen rules. It was clear this discussion wouldn't reach its end tonight, if ever. As long as I'm here, Willow announced, I'll look in on Elora Danan. You always call her by name, Drumheller, Sorcia said. To most everyone else here, she's Her Royal Highness, the Sacred Princess. To me, Elora Danan is who she is. I changed her wrappings too often to consider her a sacred princess. What did you call me, Sorcia? Drumheller, a warrior term my father taught me, before Bavmorda did away with him. A sadness swept across her fine features, like a squall line over a smooth surface lake, gone as quickly as it had arrived, helped on its way by the comforting grasp of Madmartigan's arm across her shoulders. Part pathfinder, part stalking horse, he or she is the warrior sent ahead of all the rest to charm an ambush out of hiding. How wonderful for him or her. It's the job only the best of the best can do, Willow, said Madmartigan. You speak from experience. Sorcia and we have that in common. You think I'm such a one, Sorcia? One who has too much wine? This is a dream, remember? Wine doesn't enter into it, only truth. If we were to talk nothing but truth, past time I was awake. Forgive me, Willow. It's how I've come to think of you, showing the rest of us the way, whether we like it or not. Your thoughts, then, are more generous than mine. Damn, but you're a thorny bugger sometimes, Willow, said Madmartigan, clapping him gently on the shoulder for emphasis. At my size, words have to serve as well as knives for weapons. Unlike you Daikini, it's not so easy for us to impose our will on others, or physically defend ourselves when things go wrong. We have to try persuasion and diplomacy to talk our way out of a mess. To charm? Sorcia repeated, and with a grace that matched her mate's look, Willow by the hands and drew him gently along the sky bridge. She led the dance because that was her nature, but imposed her free will with such gentle ease that he had no problem following. She matched her steps to his and tuned to the music, letting words flow with movement as though they were all part of the same song. The ambush out of hiding. You're getting too damn good at this, Willow groused in reply, but he couldn't help a wide grin of his own as she raised his arm to pass him through a full turn. A moment after, the grin was an outright laugh on all their parts as she spun herself down in a crouch so that the Nelwyn could turn her. It was all improvised, every step, yet to everyone watching it appeared as though they'd been dancing together all their lives. They passed the wine again, exchanged some gossip, spoke a little of the world. Not so easy for us either sometimes, that imposing the will you spoke of, Madmartigan noted, as seriously as Sorcia would allow, especially where it concerns the Veil folk and the realms beyond. The sharpest steel is no match for the spells that can change a man to stone or swallow him whole. I suppose you're right, Willow conceded. That dragon I rode could smash the castle to rubble with a swipe of its tail. Nobody stands alone in the world. That's what he told me. There's always someone bigger, some force greater, and there are those beneath you in the scale of things. Conversations like this, my lad, it strikes me Willow's not the name for you, bends too easily. All Nelwyns bend, Madmartigan. It's part of how we survive. And don't call me lad. I'm older than you and a father. Explains why you're turning stodgy on us. Am not. I'm no different now than I ever was. But then he thought about what he'd just said and noted the stifled giggles of his friends and sighed surrender. Of that point only. Whatever. Madmartigan was oh so gracious in victory. Willow wanted to stomp him on his big toe. But any fool enough to take a hand to you, I'll wager it comes away bloody. You're not a good Willow, my friend, or a good Nelwyn. There's way too much steel in your soul. Tone and eyes didn't match for the last thought. The one was jocular, the other belaying in totality, in deadly earnest, striking a sudden resonance in Willow that sobered him instantly. I have it, Sorcia announced. For the duration of this dream, then. Sorcia, Willow pleaded, have a little mercy. Suffer Elora's champion. I'm princess, royal born, entitled to my flights of whimsy, with the rank and privileges to enforce my royal decrees." Her voice lowered in tone, deep and rich, and she mock solemnly intoned, "Nelwyn, you may appear in form, but in substance you are something far more formidable, deserving of a title to match. This is ridiculous. For the duration of this dream, no, better yet, until we," she deliberately applied the royal pronoun, and rolled her eyes to match the court chamberlain's sonorous tones when announcing the honors list, "deign to release you." The music below was building to a wild crescendo, so infectious a rhythm that Willow was hard to stay still. Yet the force of Sorcia's eyes, the strength of her voice held him fast, commanding him with the same power she applied in battle, directing her troops over the helter-skelter clash of arms. "Shall you henceforth be known, with all rights and responsibilities due to the name?" "Between us only," Madmartigan injected conspiratorially. "Elsewise, everyone will get confused. Kings don't tend to like that." "As Thorn Drumheller." Faster than Willow could follow, she drew her sword. With each of these 3 words, she tapped him on his shoulder with the flat of her blade. Right, left, right, same as for a knight investiture. "You're both demented," Willow told them. "Takes one to know," was Madmartigan's riposte. These two fenced as fiercely with words as blades, with a skill that put even the brownie companions to shame. And that was no mean feat. In such verbal jousts, they rarely gave quarter, and while Willow tried his best to match them, even holding his own on occasion, sometimes his only recourse was to simply disengage. "Enough with this foolishness, and enough of you," he said with finality. "I'm going to Elora Danan, and then I'm going home, and if I never see the pair of you again, I swear it'll be too soon." He didn't mean it, of course, but that's the trouble with words spoken in haste and in heat. They come back to haunt you. Elora's apartments were located in the royal tower, the core of the castle, about which all its component fortifications were arrayed in an expanding set of rough circles. The rooms were sumptuously appointed, but it was still impossible to disguise the fact that Tir Slien was first and foremost a military stronghold. In most cases, the walls were thicker than a daikini was tall, the doors massive constructs of wood and iron, windows few and far between, and placed more for the convenience of snipers than their view. Elora, Madmartigan, and Sorcia shared an entire floor right below the royal suites, their bedroom next to hers. "Halt! Stand and deliver!" he heard as he stepped across the threshold. A moment later, for emphasis, he felt the sting of a brownie arrow at his backside. "That's not nice," he said, as sternly yet softly as he dared, because he didn't want to wake Elora. The room was a clutter, though most of the toys and bric-a-brac were for show, since she was still far too young to use them. At last report, she'd just about mastered the art of walking. Her bed appeared far too large for her, the child almost lost beneath the jumbled mounds of her down comforter and pillows and stuffed animals. There was an unusual amount of light, so much so that Willow's mage sight was unnecessary. Some of it was cast by the heaped embers in the hearth behind the fireplace screen. The rest came from the stars and moon above, shining through the large circular glass skylight that had been cut into the ceiling and given the chamber the airy aspect of a solar. Willow didn't see much in the way of furniture, but the floor bore a number of plush rugs, a sensible arrangement where a toddler was concerned, nothing to run into, and a fair amount of cushion beneath her whenever she fell. To the casual eye, the room was otherwise empty and unguarded. The challenge and his sore backside most eloquently proved different. "Careless big fella, eh?" said a tiny voice from behind, and Rule strode stiff-leggedly into view, the whole of the brownie's body nearly masked by the weave of the carpet. "In a rowdy humor tonight, are we?" Willow wondered. "Looks same as always," offered another voice, this from a brownie wearing a helmet and cloak of a slain mouse. "Talks different, though, putting on airs like some dandy from court. Looking to better himself by making nice with Elora Danan. Could be an imposter." Willow decided he'd just reached the end of his patience with this dream. He snapped his fingers and was rewarded by a pair of outraged squawks from the brownies as a pair of fiery sparks burst beneath them, leaving tiny pops of thunder in their wake and the smell of burning air, as a stroke of lightning does in a summer thunderstorm. "Trust me," he told them in a tone that made clear he wasn't joking anymore. "It's me." "Could have simply said so," came from Rule. I'm tired. It's late. I'd like my spirit to be back home with the rest of me, enjoying a good night's sleep. Is that so much to ask?" The brownies looked at each other as though he was talking crazy and said as much altogether to themselves, ignoring him completely. Rule's approach was pragmatic. The posturing was left to Frangine. Willow took advantage of their disputations to cross to the bed for a closer look at his goddaughter. In many ways, she was still one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen, on a par with his own children. Her hair was spun gold, shot through with strands of fire that might well have come from Sorce's own head. She was plump, but babies were supposed to be so at her age, given the impression that her body was little more than an arrangement of circles pinned together. Round head, round belly, round arms, round legs. There was an air of peace about her, of an innocence and freshness that had nothing to do with her age. She was someone whose natural state was a smile of delight and wonder as the world arrayed before her. It was a warm and welcoming room, the kind where it would be easy to spend some time. By her sheer presence, Elora Danan made this ancient fortress a happier place, and all within better folk. "Now, lass," Willow muttered, "if your charms can only work as well on the stiff-necked, stone-skulled rulers of the realms beyond, there may well be some hope for the world." His foot bumped something on the floor, and he reached down to recover a ball. It fit comfortably in his hand, and on an impulse he gave it a spin, balancing it on his outstretched forefinger, thinking while it turned of what the dragon had told him. He could still feel the aftertaste of the terror of those moments, but it was fast fading before his growing fascination with the new way of looking at the world. He stopped the ball, arbitrarily labeling the place where his fingertip rested as Tirasleen. Then he turned the ball right around in his grasp to the point opposite. He put his thumb there and called it Angwin, and yearned to journey from one to the other. Never happened, of course. Not any while soon. Too many responsibilities at home. Yet Nelwyns were a long-lived people, and in next to no time the children would be grown. Perhaps then. "Thought you were coming, big fella." Rule again, having scrambled lithely to a perch on Elora's bedstand. "Everyone says that," he noted as he set the ball aside with its fellows. "Seems sensible enough, since here you are." "It's a dream. I'm at home, Rule, asleep in my own bed. Trust me on that." "If you say so." "Me," Frangine said. "I say it's guilt." He would have emphasized the word with a shout had not a stern shush from Rule and Willow both not dampened the volume in the barest nick of time. "Elora's celebration, it is, a year tomorrow since she came to Tirasleen. Is Willow, her savior, her godfather, coming to be part of the festivities? He says not. He has to tend to his precious fields." I don't plant now. My family doesn't eat later." "You're a wizard, Willow," said Rule. "You'll manage." "Does he at least send a present for his little lovely?" Frangine continued remorselessly, without missing a beat. "I don't see one." "That," agreed the other brownie, "is shameful." "I have a present." "With you?" from both of them in perfect unison. He was about to say no when some inspiration prompted his hand toward the traveling pouch on his left hip. These were one of his earliest successes in learning the art of and craft of magic. The apparent size of the bag bore no relationship whatever to the volume within, or how much it could carry. Food would stay fresh. Water wouldn't spill. If something fit through the drawstring opening, it could be carried inside. All he had to do was think about what he needed and reach in. If it had been packed away, his hand would instantly find it. Which is what happened. He thought of the bear, and there it was. Oddly enough, since his last recollection of the bear was leaving it on the table in his workshop, he took this as proof positive he was dreaming. "She's sleeping all right?" he asked as he smoothed the hair on the bear's head. "Like a baby," said Rule. "Dolt," said Frangine. "What'd you expect? She is a baby." "Why do you ask, Willow?" "No reason, Rule." He held the bear up before him and looked at it square in his crystal eyes. "Well, here we are, you and I, about to part company. Perhaps that's the purpose of these meanderings, to deliver in dreams what I'll fail to in the flesh. Forgive me for that, Elora Danan," he said to the girl. "I don't know why I waited. No doubt because, since this gift came from my hands, I wanted it to come to you from my hands. No stranger between us. No distance. Let my bear stand in my stead. Will that be acceptable, Highness? All that I would be, were I here, Let him represent.
Willow!
Yes, Rule.
Do you know what you're doing?
Yes, Rule.
I don't think so. Look at yourself, wizard. You're glowing.
Bless my soul, so I am.
You're not supposed to cast spells in here. Death dog's fangs, hissed Frangine. You're not supposed to be able to cast spells in here. There are protective wards set around the room thicker than the damnable walls.
Not my doing, not my power, was Willow's reply. It's a resonance, a reflection of Elora's.
Impressive.
Very, actually, Rule.
Since when is she a sorceress?
Frangine said, with more of a pinch of outrage, as if she should have been the very first to know. In the strict sense of the word, I don't think she is.
Don't you know?
Willow sighed. Frangine, we're talking prophecy here. When was the last time you heard of an oracle being specific? No one's sure what she can do, and it's not as if she's able yet to tell. Myself, I wonder if she's like the dragons, outside all the rules and structures that define the world. That would explain their interest in her.
Never seen a dragon, Willow.
And there was envy in Rule's voice. It was a wonder, even if it was out of my own imagination. Willow shook his head, to bring his focus back to the moment at hand. As for Elora Danan, I'm fairly sure wards are no use against her, nor are spells on her. She possesses a kind of neutral immunity.
If that's so, Frangine challenged sarcastically, then how could Witch Queen Bavmorda have hoped to destroy her with the right of oblivion, eh?
She was a baby, Frangine, was Willow's sensible reply. Power's useless without the knowledge to properly wield it.
She's still a baby,
Rule said. Bavmorda's dead, and we've spent the best part of the year since exterminating her death dogs.
And that leaves all the world brimming with sweetness and light, including the trolls and ghouls and goblins and gaunts and things too foul to even name?
The brownie had a point. That's not a problem, Rule. I think I have added my knowledge to her strength through my bear, he said with a sudden shy smile, pleased at the rush of inspiration. That should make her defenses as comprehensive and resilient now as when she'll be full grown. Not much use against a steel knife, I'll grant you. You will have to be Madmartigan and Sorcer's lookout, but pure hell for a magic one. Satisfied? She stirred, and he feared he'd woken her, but all she did was shift toward her back in such a way that her arms flopped open on either side of her. She was all twisted up in nightgown and comforter, one bare leg exposed to the evening chill. The hearth was doing its valiant best, but even this late in the spring the nights remained significantly colder than the days. There'd be frost on the breasts of those sentries standing watch outside. Willow tucked the bear snug under the crook of the arm nearest him. As if that had been all she wanted for, Elora rolled suddenly toward him, wrapping both arms around the bear and drawing her legs together, knees up, to ensure the stuffed animal's safe imprisonment. Her gown was a proper tangle. There was nothing he could do about it without surely waking her, so he contented himself with rearranging the covers. So taken was he with the baby's charm that he missed a hurried conference between the brownies, in which they decided there was no way they were letting him travel home alone in so obviously demented a state. They were inside his traveling pouch before he knew what they were about, and try as he might to get them out, they remained well and truly hidden. "Suit yourselves, then," he told them. "I'm done here." Not quite. There was one final obligation as easily and happily fulfilled with Elora as with his own. He smoothed her hair from her brow and gave her a kiss and a wish for the sweetest of dreams, the happiest of tomorrows, and that was that. The next he knew, it was morning. He woke with a start beside his wife where he'd known he'd been all the night through. He was so thankful for that realization that it was a long few moments before his mind registered what his eyes beheld from the first, a pair of brownies sitting side by side at the foot of his bed. After all, giving the lie to the still loveliness of the sunrise, with mist curling off the riverfront, the field cast in azure shades accented by the merest hint of morning rose, the quiet broke by an intermittent bird-song. The whole of the dawn as prosaic and normal as could be. He learned that while he'd slept. The world, as he'd known it, had come to an end. Chapter 1. The eagles told them the rider was close. Thorn didn't see. The brownies were nervous enough around the tall folk in their own country, but at least they had a wealth of trees and undergrowth to mask their presence. Here in the shadow of the great mountain range that split the continent from top to bottom, there was nothing but prairie grasslands from slope to horizon. They wanted to hide and told Thorn so repeatedly, even more loudly and insistently than the other, volleying protests and epitaphs back and forth as if it was a game of tennis. Thorn didn't hear. The animal's shod hooves struck in a leaden cadence, her every step bespeaking a fatigue sunk deep into her bones. She'd run as far and as fast as she was able, but she was done. The scent of fear was strong from her, its cause brutally clear from the fresh wounds that scarred her flanks and haunch. A Daikini warrior sat atop her back, his own boots scored by the same claws that had slashed his mount. The parade ground, perfection of tack and armor, was dulled by a thickening coat of trail dust, the curve of back and shoulders giving eloquent evidence of the toll this journey had taken. In basic form, he looked much the same as Thorn himself, though, like all his race, he stood better than twice the Nelwyn's size, mostly in his legs. As a race, Daikinis considered themselves lords of the earth, and didn't share well with those, like Nelwyns and the far smaller brownies, who'd come before. Both bow and blade were slung loose, close at hand for quick and easy use. The young man's eyes never rested, scanning the way ahead as intensely as his every other sense did the trail behind. Every so often he would reach forward to stroke a hand along the mare's sweat-stained neck, then give her powerful shoulders a reassuring pat. She needed rest, as did he. Even this stumble-footed place was more than she could long maintain. Stark from both horse and rider was the certain knowledge that wherever they stopped would be the site of their last stand. The trail they'd followed would bring them right to Thorn and his companions. The pace they maintained meant they'd reach them near nightfall. Thorn didn't care. His own boots cast puffs of dirt into the air about his feet, and he made his way to the edge of the scar. Dust, without any of the weight or consistency of proper earth, leached dry of moisture, of minerals, of life itself. Dull gray to the sight, powder to the touch, the crumbling detritus of the tomb, it cast a shadow film over eyes and tongue that tainted every sensation. Scrub weeds and tumbleweeds marked the landscape, though seeds unlucky enough to put down roots found no substance, either to anchor or sustain them. Most were blown away by the first rough wind. The few that remained were ugly, stunted things, with little hopes of lasting a season, much less beyond. Before him, the continental divide formed an unassailable rampart stretching to the right and left as far as the eye could see, except for this place. Until 12 years ago, a mountain stood here. Paramount in the range, that awful night as cataclysms and disasters raged across the whole of the 12 domains, it had simply been destroyed. Thorn had seen all manner of natural disasters and each time been awed by how quickly and tenaciously nature had rushed back to heal the wounds. Here, though, those normal rules seemed no longer to apply. Everything and every one that had lived within sight of the blast was gone, as though they'd never been, and nothing had stepped in since to fill the void. As with all the others, he said aloud, mainly to break the eerie silence, absently winding a length of braided beard around his forefinger as he surveyed the desolation before him. A whole world! I've wandered to see such sights as this, one after the other, one by one, the smashed and broken places. Almost as though the devastation couldn't be believed, it wasn't real, unless seen with his own eyes. This was the last, and awful to behold as the first. His first and dominant impression of the scar was one of smoothness, as though a terrible god had sliced the mountain from its fellows as neatly as Thorn might a fresh-baked muffin from its tin, and then wantonly smashed it to bits. The ground within had been seared to bedrock, stripped of even the potential of new life, fused on top to glass, so that the scene most resembled a shallow bowl, although this one was miles across and easily 100 feet deep. No dust settled within the rim, creating the impression that the crater was wiped neatly and properly clean each morning by some giant cloth. Wherever there were storms, the water that fell outside the scar rushed away downhill, each drop of rain apparently desperate to find a more hospitable place to light. Looking within, however, Thorn couldn't see a hint of liquid, where there should have been a lake reflecting the brilliant blue of the late spring, late morning sky. There was a queer beauty to the place that he had to admit. The dominant color was black, shot through with streams and reefs of darkling shades from a palette of some mad potter. In his mind's eye, Thorn saw another field of primal desecration, this one set amidst rolling woodlands, a place once renowned for its beauty, forever ruined. The strength of its walls, the courage of its knights, the skill of its sorcerers, none of that saved the fabled Daikini fortress of Tirasleen. The castle and its rulers embodied the hope of the world, and it had been wiped away in a single instant. There, a dozen years ago, Thorn hadn't approached as close as this. He'd stood at the head of the valley, staring with dulled eyes as though he himself had become one of the dead, in the faint and futile hope that each blink of his eyelids would somehow restore the glory that once was, and especially the lives of his lost friends. The memory was ice in his heart, and he folded over on himself as though he'd been stabbed, lowering his forehead as he knelt until it touched the ground. He was glad he was alone, for such a grief as this should have no witnesses. Neither brownies nor eagles ever came near these blasted, broken places. Bastion and Anel wouldn't even overfly them. They had too much respect for the dead, and for the unknown force that had slain them. Thorn's face twisted as though he'd been struck a physical blow, but no tears fell. He'd run himself dry the first monstrous day before Tirasleen. For all the time that had passed, and all he'd learned since, the wound remained as fresh and raw as ever. Its sole legacy was a resonance that led him from one sight to the next, from the same inexorable attraction of a compass needle for the pole. After the first few, and especially as he honed his innate talent as a wizard, the pattern of destruction had become clear. Each location was of power, a crossroad where the ley lines of energy of the physical world intersected with their counterparts in the realms beyond, the domains of Fairy, home to the Vale folk. As consequence, the devastation had been as great in their lands, and the scars as deep. There, as here, some looked on what happened as a natural occurrence, others as a mystical sign, still others as an act of war. Each party had its own opinion as to the cause and reason. Each had a favorite place to lay blame, with the net result that relations between the 12 kingdoms, never comfortable on the best of days, went into a steep and precipitous decline. The passage of better than a decade since the cataclysm without any further such incidents had substantially eased fears among the Daikinis, but most of the Vale folk lived at a different pace. To them, the human span was little better than a mayfly's, and the cataclysm a flashpoint far too fresh in memory to be ignored. Beyond the obvious that a force of mind-numbing power had in a single savage moment annihilated a score of locations across the whole of the world, nothing was known. Not the nature of the force, or its origin, or its purpose. The years since brought to Thorn the realization that surprisingly few were all that eager to learn any of those answers, as though doing so would call down the same doom, or worse, on their own heads. It was a choice Thorn himself faced at every sight. He'd known from the start what was required of him, yet in each instance found himself holding back. He was no less reluctant today. "No," he said, face still buried from the world, giving his voice the hollow sound of someone speaking in a box. "That's not right. I'm not reluctant. I'm afraid." He stood, walked away from the scar for a couple or 3 steps before coming to the end of that reflexive impulse and the trailing to a stop. "Is this it, then?" he asked himself. "Is this what I've come to? All the work and wandering, a dozen years on the road and hiding, all for nothing? You saved the best for last, Peck." And he made the diminutive as cruel an insult as any who'd use it against him. "The resonance of the cataclysm are as strong here as at Tirasleen. If there are answers to be found, there's nowhere better." The part of him labeled Nelwyn Common Sense wailed, "I don't want to be here. I want to be home." To be told in turn, "But you are here. So what are you going to do about it?" Then more cruelly, and until this is done, you have no home." He bared his teeth. Nelwyns were built small, so went the tales of creation told by all save Nelwyns, because the great giver passes them by, their attention always caught by those of more significance. The Nelwyn purpose in the scheme of things was to provide amusement to those more blessed, but Nelwyn spirits and Nelwyn hearts and Nelwyn minds bore little relation to the bodies that housed them. With every hand against them, in a world shaped for creatures many times their size, they took on the characteristics of the land they made their home. They were tough. They endured. Above all, they adapted. When faced with a threat, they got out of the way. When they couldn't get out of the way, they fought with a strength and tenacity that had to be respected. When they had to fight man or God, this world or any of the others, they would find a way to overcome. The cataclysm had left its mark on Thorn as much as on the land. He was leaner than he'd been, his body tougher by uncounted miles of wandering across the whole face of the globe, which he knew now, for fact, was a globe. No need any more for him to take the dragon's word for it. His skin was tight across his face, highlighting the shape of chin and jaw, giving him the aspect of a Nelwyn better than twice his age. He'd let his hair grow, a beard as well, until all that could be seen of his face was a nose, strong cheekbones, and his eyes, and even they were set between a pair of magnificently wild brows. The beard he braided like his old teacher, the High Aldwin, but the hair he'd chosen to style in the fashion of a Dakini warrior. Oddly, while the beard had grown in the color of dull silver, his hair had lost none of its youthful hue. If anything, it had grown more autumnal over time, making it a rich auburn, red with mahogany highlights, where before it had been the other way around. He dressed like a wanderer, in whatever struck his fancy and his comfort from the markets of every continent. It was his eyes that marked him most, though. The hazel he'd been born with had given way to green, and from there to a blue that was mixed with gray, like sky when his mood was fair, like fresh-forged steel when it was not. They were haunted eyes. They had seen too much, but that was only on the surface. Beneath, past where even Thorn cared to look on those rare occasions when he caught sight of his own reflection, was something far harder and more dangerous, the part of him he had earned his name. Thorn anchored a stanchion deep in the earth, with a goodly length of line tied snug about it, looped around his waist and through a metal ring affixed to his belt. He donned well-worn buckskin gloves to protect his long, sensitive hands and tossed the rope over the edge. He wanted to hesitate, but knew that if he did, he'd find a chink in his resolve, worry at it like a rat until the whole edifice crumbled. Some fights couldn't be run from. Part pathfinder, part stalking horse, came Sorsha's voice from memory, as clear as if she once more stood before him. The warrior sent ahead of all the rest to charm an ambush out of hiding. How wonderful for him, Thorn grumbled now as he had then. Putting his back on the scar, he took tight hold of his line and stepped off the rim after it. As soon as he touched bottom and disengaged his harness, a piece of rock caught his eye, hardly bigger than a thumbnail. He'd picked it up, rolling it a few moments between his palms, his eyes half closed, senses cautiously aware as they built a picture of the stone within his mind. Great age, he felt, and yet, as the world views such things, this particular peak had hardly been born. Young and fresh, its stark, sharp lines barely touched by sun and wind and water. There was strength to it and special pride. This was a place of power, for all the good that had done it. There was a keening in the air, a mournful dissonance that might be wind, but he knew better, because he felt it from the stone in his hand. He thrust the pebble into a pocket of his vest, wandering deeper across the crater. Cautious steps at first, out of the concern that the surface might prove as slippery as it looked, but that wariness quickly passed. Anyone watching would perceive neither rhyme nor reason to Thorn's progress. He'd walked one way, then another, pass stones by, pick one up, toss it aside, suddenly and inexplicably go back to the one he'd skipped before and add it to the growing collection in his pouch. His ramble was a revelation, and he continued to wander through this boneyard of stone, collecting bits and pieces of the corpse. From outside, the surface appeared featureless, so like a household bowl in appearance that he thought it would prove as clean in fact. However, while the mountain had been smashed into bits, it had been far from obliterated. Each step brought him another flash-fire image of every aspect of the peak's existence, from birth to sudden early death. There was no consciousness, no life, as he understood the term. Yet it had been as alive as he, rich in its own way with yearnings and desires. When he was tired, he simply stopped and sat. He was hungry as well, he realized, his throat parched. The gleaming, smooth surface of the scar acted like a mirror, reflecting the heat at the same time as its dark color absorbed it, giving him a painful insight into what it must feel like to be on a blazing hot griddle. He moistened his mouth with a swallow of water from his canteen, then took the edge off his growling stomach with a hunk of biscuit. His eyes were narrowed to slits, but that wasn't any real help. The glare beat right through his skin and set the underside of his skull to throbbing. Next time, he vowed with asperity, he'd remember his damned hat. He popped another morsel into his mouth and spat it out almost immediately, before he could properly bite down on it and shattered a tooth. It wasn't a piece of biscuit in his hand, but one of the stones he'd gathered. As he held it, his eyes rose and shifted sideways. Quickly, he was on his feet and hobbling as fast as his stinted legs could carry him toward a spot marked on the mountain's memory. He remembered as he went the old saw that Nelwyns weren't made for walking because they were meant to spend their days close to hearth and home. He'd always wondered why they had never been enough for him. Should have been paying more attention to the present, not the past, as he put a wrong step on the slick surface and one foot skidded out from under him, stretching him full length hard enough to keep him lying there a good long minute while he recovered his wits. He was sore, mostly about the knees and forearms, which had borne the brunt of the impact, but otherwise unhurt as he pushed himself gingerly upright until his body blocked the sunlight enough to cast the sight into a fair semblance of shadow. Nothing happened when he held out a stone, or even when he placed it on the ground. It was a piece of debris, like all the rest around him. Didn't look right, though. Not where it was, nor how it lay. He thought a moment, without the slightest notion of what was to come next, ignoring a faint hail shouted along the breeze overhead, until his left hand moved of its own volition. He couldn't help a small smile, because even the smallest and most inconspicuous use of power was a delight to him. There were no fireworks, not the slightest tingle of energy. As his mouth pursed thoughtfully and his fingers turned the stone and moved it, just so. He stroked the tips of his fingers across the lower lip and considered what he'd done. Almost immediately, a new impulse made him draw another pebble from the pouch. This one wasn't set beside the first, however, but about a handspan distance and off at a diagonal. The movement was like popping a brick from a dam. Again and again, his hand returned to his pocket, placing one stone after the other on the ground before him. When at last it was empty, he'd built a fair-sized pile. Interesting, he mused aloud. I didn't think I'd gathered so many. As he spoke, he reached out to fractionally adjust the alignment, so one of the components. There, he said. That's right. It was, too, he feared. He felt it in his bones. He was looking at the mountain in small, the towering central spire, a sheer drop in the plainsward side, with two subordinate ridges binding to the range beyond, plus the coals that flowed off them. This was a proud and arrogant piece of creation, no easy conquest for the man foolish enough to try. He looked around, aware once more of the wailing undertone of anguish he'd sensed earlier. If stones could cry... He took a breath, let it out slowly, hearing a voice calling from the distance and paying it no mind. I'm sorry, he said to the cairn. I wish I could undo what's been done. A furious gust of energy from out of the heart of the mountains struck upward through the soles of his feet and rocked him back off his heels, hard enough to knock him flat. As he fell, senses reeling from the onslaught, a wild, almost incoherent mix of rage and betrayal, he wrapped his arms protectively around himself, like a boxer losing the ability to defend himself. Thorn spat blood, watched it strike his miniature mountain and then be absorbed into the very stone. The fused earth beneath it began to bubble and boil as though being eaten away by some ferocious acid, with secondary fissures radiating outward from the peak to mar more of its polished perfection. The cairn was no longer an accumulation of stones and pebbles. It was hardening visibly before his eyes, taking on the cohesion and solidity of the mountain it had once been, even as it once more forged its link with the earth from which it had been raised. There was the taste of grit in his mouth, and as the tiny bits of pumice ground across his teeth, he felt a sudden flush of heat shoot up from him through the soles of his feet with such force that he was consumed before he could utter a sound. It wasn't pain, at least that resembled any he'd felt on those occasions when he'd been physically burned, but it was very nearly more than he could bear. He was sure he was glowing, that every object around him was either melting or bursting instantly to flame, because that had to be what was happening to him. Hard on the heels of the incredible heat came a delicious chill, striking to the heart of the bones and soul from the outside in, locking him in form and place. There was a strange duality of perception, akin to what he felt when his insight merged his consciousness with the eagle's to allow him to see the world through their eyes, an awareness that he retained the potential of movement while becoming even more firmly rooted to this spot. He turned his head, his body following, moving not as it used to, though the articulation of his limbs, but seemed instead to flow. Parts of him would liquefy and recast themselves once more when he chose to come to rest, and if each time he looked a little different, an arm lost there, a leg impossibly stretched and bent, a face increasingly devoid of human features, that didn't matter. His essence remained true. However, as he surveyed the stony boneyard, there was a form and a structure to the landscape that he hadn't perceived before. His wish had been granted, and he realized that he could now complete conspicuously what had been begun solely on instinct. There was a way to make amends and set things right. He could pick and choose among the broken remains, to gather the pieces and restore them to their proper sequence. It wouldn't be an easy task, rebuilding a mountain by hand, but he had no doubts he would be up to it. As for time, he sensed he was no longer bound by Nelwyn or even Valefolk constraints. His span was mated to the world itself and measured its days on the same terms. An age to him would encompass the rise and fall of a continent, from the dawn of his kind to the long past its sunset. Even as these thoughts came to him, and that wasn't so very quickly, for his mind was resonating in tune to his body, casting aside all unnecessary memories and focusing solely on the task at hand, he caught sight of the next stone and added to his construction, and began his glacial trek toward it. With every breath he became more content. This was peace. This was fulfillment. He felt a swash of air as something large passed close by overhead. The impact was faintly felt of tiny feet on his shoulders. The next he knew, equally small fingers had grabbed a respectable handful of nose hair. The brownie tugged, and Thorn popped back into his head with an outraged yelp and a tremendous sneeze. "Talking to you, sirrah!" cried Frangine, brimful of outrage to match the mountains before he could say a word. "Saving you!" echoed his companion, triumphantly brandishing his prize in one hand while holding on to Thorn's shirt with the other. "Fool's errand, if ever there was one," Frangine finished, so close to Thorn's eye that his face filled Denelwyn's vision, even though his body didn't stand as high as many meadow flowers. "Can we go now, please?" Rule demanded after a shallow nod of acknowledgement. "We really aren't welcome here." "Hang on, Rule!" cried Frangine, and then the eagles were upon them. Two great sets of claws sank themselves deep through the fabric of padded vest, wool undershirt, and cotton shirt, closing firmly enough to hold him secure without doing any harm. Thorn felt the backwash of two powerful wings, a span that surpassed the height of the tall Daikini, and cried out as he was summarily yanked from the ground, and it wasn't physical separation that caused him pain, though his ordeal he'd felt like he was melting. In actuality, his body hasn't changed shape in the slightest, but the severance of his psychic bond with the mountains. "Careless," said Bastian, not bothering to hide his disdain as his limp burdened skyward. "A fledgling mistake," sniffed his mate, Anel, holding guard position just off Bastian's left wing, a little behind and below to catch whatever might fall should Thorn start struggling. "I expected better." Easy for you to say, protested Thorn feebly in his own defense.
Speak when you remember how,
Frangine told him from just outside his left ear.
When you have something worth saying,
ruled from his right. Thorn couldn't think of anything, so he cast his awareness outward to join Enel, a far safer choice than distracting Bastion. As always, the view took his breath away. For those first moments, he luxuriated in the caress of air across his skin, personalizing the sensation even though he knew they were really hers, aware of every twitch and tickle that signified an adjustment of feathers and pinions as she soared. Though they hadn't risen all that high above the ground, the air was significantly cooler. The first time he'd merged senses with the raptors, it had been as great a shock as plunging into a winter stream. He'd broken the link immediately to lie shivering in a heap, his body tucked in tight to itself, terrified he'd never been able to take another breath because the one before had frozen him inside and out. Paradoxically, the sun lay across the eagle's russet gold back like a quilt, a furnace without to complement that one within. Stoked by Enel's heart, which sent blood racing through her body far faster than Thorn's did through his own. That wasn't very nice, Thorn grumbled, stifling another sneeze as he was unceremoniously deposited on the ground close to their campsite, the clearing mostly shrouded in sunset shadows. He tried to stand, but instead flailed uselessly with arms and legs as though he'd forgotten how to use them. He moved like a baby at first, but each random gesture cast another line between spirit and flesh until, after what seemed an eternity, although it really wasn't very long at all, the wayward pieces of himself were once more bound tightly and properly together.
Compared to what, may I ask?
Came Frangine's arch riposte, mocking the manner of courtiers he'd seen in their journey.
Try to get your attention,
Rule said in a more pragmatic tone.
Called until our voices broke. But did you listen? Did you care?
Then in unison,
I think not.
Thorn made a face. He'd seen goddesses with less hotter than these diminutive creatures. They'd walked the world together, these brownies and he had the inescapable feeling that he was still being taken on sufferance. Truth to tell, he was always more comfortable with the eagles. They were killers when they had to be, but they lacked the brownie's instinct for verbal jugular. The eagles hadn't landed themselves, but instead returned immediately to the air, beating quickly to altitude until they were lost from sight amongst the darkening eastward sky. I didn't hear, he told them all, voice to the brownies, mind speech to the eagles.
Too busy spirit dancing,
scoffed Frangine.
We could have left you, Drumheller,
chided Rule.
Should have.
Madness enough that you go gallivanting into the heart of such an accursed place.
Don't expect us to come to save you.
I know it was hard, Thorn began, but Rule cut him off.
Sometimes, wizard, you know nothing, he said sharply, about what is needful, and especially about what's hard.
Thorn nodded. I ask your pardon, Rule, he said formally, and yours, Frangine. I offer my apologies to you, and to Nell and Bastion. This was wrong of me. It's one thing to risk my own life. I have no right to make you do the same.
Find what you were looking for, did you?
Asked Frangine with a practiced air of malicious glee. He knew that he was coming and answered like a schoolboy before his headmaster, a sensation he thought he'd put behind him ages ago. No, was a flat reply.
Are we surprised?
The brownie threw up his hands in the all too familiar gesture of exasperation. Frangine, I had to try.
What? You refuse to believe the fire is hot until you're burning.
I know the fire's hot, but I need to learn the nature of whatever it set it alight.
You've looked for 10 years and more, Drumheller. If you haven't learned by now, win.
He had no answer, and so made none, which only provoked an even more acerbic outburst from the brownie.
What is the use, Drumheller, I ask you? Far be it from us to offer the slightest hint of criticism, O mighty wizard, or place the slightest impediment in the way of your quest. But is this to be the pattern of our lives? Are we fated to wander the 12 domains until we drop while you continue your compendium of the sites of the Cataclysm's greatest disasters?
Frangine was right. His search had taken him across the face of the world to lands and peoples he'd never dreamed of, yet he felt no closer to his answers today than when he set out. It was a realization that had been growing in him for a long time. with a bitterness that ate at his insides like an acid poison, that he had doubly failed, not only to save those he loved, but also to avenge them. "Are you quite finished?" he demanded. "Will you ever be?" Rule spoke up. "This isn't the time, Frangine." There was a different shading in his voice, as though something had tripped an alarm in his head. Thorn caught the shift, and his own focus sharpened accordingly. Frangine didn't. "Will it ever be?" Frangine snapped in return. Over the years, Frangine had grown into a veritable peacock. With nary a stitch out of place, regardless of circumstance, he always managed to convey the sense that his outfits had been constructed the very morning for someone who lived on the cutting edge of fashion. Thorn could never decide which amazed him more, the sheer variety of the brownie's designs, or how he managed to come up with them in the middle of nowhere. Rule, by contrast, was the more practical of the pair, possessing a sobriety of manner that was echoed in the style of his clothes, which were so comfortably broken in they seemed like they'd be part of him forever. In this instance, buckskin mainly, trousers and pullover tunic, with hard-soled boots that tied snug to the leg at the knee, thickly woven cotton shirt beneath the tunic, and an ankle-length canvas coat that swirled out from his body like a cloak when he walked, to protect him from the evening chill. "The daikini!" Rule reminded his companion, with an edge to his tone that matched the keenness of the blades he wore at his belt. There was no ornamentation to him. His hair was far longer than Frangine's, the color of richly polished cherrywood, falling past his backside, swept straight from the face, and gathered in leather sieve that was anchored at the base of the neck by a leather clip chased with drops of silver that Thorn had made for him. "What daikini?" Thorn asked. Frangine cocked a dismissive eyebrow. "The one we've been screaming at you about all the livelong day!" He rounded on Rule. "Should have scared the brute away ourselves. Made the stupid daikini, stupid horse, think wandering into the land of angry hornets. Ha!" "If they could have passed us by," Rule told him, "they would have. They've no more liking for this accursed place than we do." Then to Thorn, "This is something I think you should see, Drumheller." "As you wish." There was no ease to his movements as he followed the brownies through the scrub brush and tumbleweed. The memory of his struggle with the mountains has sunk past thought and deep into his bones. He couldn't cast himself loose of the images, which in their turn lashed him with the sting of a sorrow so awful he had no words for it. The mountains had left their mark on him, a hole straight through his own heart to match the one through theirs. The daikini had chosen a good defensive position as could be managed on this barren, broken land on the steepest slope with a fair rise of rocks to his back. He'd stripped a good-sized clearing to give him a broad and deep field of fire, and used a gathered tinder for an impressive fire to warm his bones and give him light to see by. Thorn's insight revealed a wandering zephyr, a ghost of a breeze so faint it barely tickled the distant grass, thrown into turmoil as it came close by the violent updrafts of the blazing campfire. The daikini slumbered on the far side of the flames, probably wasn't even aware of it, yet to Thorn it was like sitting ringside for a fierce back-alley brawl. The zephyr seemed aware of his sympathy, and it swirled up on him from behind to stroke him top to toe. He had to clench his teeth to keep from laughing at its touch, as it was certain the struggle flashed across his face was like an alarm beacon. Yet the daikini didn't notice. All remained still. The man's horse snuffled, shifting from one hobbled hoof to the next, not quite nervous, but no longer wholly calm. Instinct told the mare she should be somewhere else, but she was too worn out to care. Moreover, in the recent past, she'd taken a nasty wound from which she'd never truly recovered. A glance told Thorn all he needed to know. Death dogs. They carried no poison, but their bites were ferociously septic. If they drew your blood, you were sure to sicken from it. All too often, that infection killed. He could smell the poison within her, even though she'd fought it to the point where it now lay dormant. This night's rest was welcome, but while she might manage a plodding walk in the morning, the first decent, sustained run would be the end of her. She knew that, too. He turned back to the zephyr, but that little wind was too faint and fickle to be of any real use. Wouldn't matter anyway. If death dogs were coming for them, it would be from dead downwind, following the scent of their prey. "Deserves it, he does. That's what I say," Frangine said in his ear without bothering to hide his disdain. So quick to condemn? Thorn replied, his own voice softer than Zephyr's, pitching the words around to the brownie hunkered below the curve of his head. To fight a pack of death dogs and not expect them to follow? Too stupid to live, you ask me, a dismissal emphasized by the flick of delicately laced cuffs from soft silk doe-skin sleeves. Death dogs, you say? Obviously from the cut of the wounds, Rule said quietly, if not the stench of their poison. His two swords were carved from the fangs of a death dog they'd slain, and in among the tribal tattoos that decorated his face and torso were a set of scars left by the battle. He'd been thrown from the neck of one hound, and another had taken a snap at him in midair, breaking skin and bones with a snaggletooth fang that came within a hair of ending his life altogether. The fact that Rule could still walk at all, much less with his old grace and ease, was due solely to the Nelwyn's talents as a healer. Leftovers from the old days, perhaps? Thorn wondered. A long way from home, if so. As are we, Frangine retorted. I'll keep watch, Rule volunteered, and was gone before the sound of the words had faded, skirting the periphery of the firelight as he made his way toward a higher perch on the far side of the clearing. I thought we were done with them, Thorn mused, that those few who survived Bavmorda were long slain. From all accounts, the hunt had been a brutal, bloody business, and while he had no love for those hell-touched beasts, he was also glad that he had no part in their extermination. Evidently not. Might just be a rogue band of wanderers. Like us, you mean, wizard? Except, in all these years, in all our travels, we've seen no evidence of them before. Drumheller, this land has daikini like our own. They ride horses, they herd livestock, they farm crops just like our own. Some of them they call the Vale folk by different names, but Sherlindria's scattered her groves across this part of the world, same as she did across our own. With so much else in common between us, why not death dogs? And if they are here, I for one wish to be someplace else. You're too harsh on the boy, Frangine. He knows they're following us. Look at his choice of campsite. He's defended himself as best he can. He's asleep, isn't he? He's human, subject to human frailties. True enough there, Drumheller. A huge and mocking grin split Frangine's face. Some warrior. Ha! Didn't sense brownie fingers twist his hair or tangle or pick his purses clean. They were remarkable thieves. He discovered that right at the start, with skills to shame magpies and pack rats both. If something could be carried, it could be stolen, and what they could carry often bore no relationship to their diminutive stature. In that regard, they were as much a surprise as Nelwyn's. Find anything of interest? Scraping of field rations, said the quick reply. More for horse than man. Him? He's been living off the land. Lean pickings, then, if our own experience is anything to go by. No ease with letters. How so? Nothing to write with, nothing to write on. A sharp contrast to Thorn himself, who was always scribbling in a dog-eared notebook. He'd taught the brownies during their travels, only to realize too late that he'd provided them with another means of expression, which they enthusiastically put to use, that was as eloquent as it was outrageous. They had a little respect for the property as for a person, and many were the walls and reputations that had suffered for it. Straight ahead sorts of man, Frangine continued. What he sees is, and there's the end to it, much like you. I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. As you like. See the device on his coat? He's sworn to somebody's service. The king in Angwin, Thorn nodded. Another wanderer, then, far from home. Oh, joy, that we have so much in common. Thorn looked away from the fire and the mountains. Angwin's mainly south from here, and west. It's never had a presence in these parts. The few settlements don't acknowledge its sovereignty. What's he doing here? Ask him, why don't you? Frangine, you think he's following us? The brownie neither spoke nor gestured in response. He didn't need to. His certainty was as rock-solid as the ground beneath his feet. Drumheller! There wasn't the slightest attempt to leave the full measure of scorn heaped onto that single word. We're here. He's there. The death dogs are here. Coincidence? I think not. Will the pair of you be silent? Said Rule, returning hurriedly from his scout post on the far fire of the encampment. Wood of the Maker, I can hear you. That wreck and ruin of a horse can hear you. The daikini can hear you, except he's too ignorant to comprehend it and far too happy in his dreams. Damnation, Frangine! Will you always have to make a speech? His friend lifted his eyebrows most eloquently as to say, Look who's talking. You're not impressed anymore. We've heard it before. You're only going to make matters worse. Can you just say that's what you have to do? Can't you just say what's what and have done with it? Frangine continued as if no one else said a word. He liked his dialogue, and he was determined to speak it through to the end. A pair of fools, that's you, he finished in Thorn's face. The one's cleaving to the other, a toss to tell which is the greater. Thorn knew better than to press the point until some time had passed, enough for passions to cool. It wasn't the first time the brownies, one or both, had gotten upset with him. He'd long ago realized that the size of their bodies had no limitation to the magnitude of their emotions. Quite the opposite, in fact. The eagles are quiet, he noted, taking temporary refuge in a discreet change of subject. The eagles don't want to give anything away, Rule told him. These death dogs don't just follow their noses. What do you mean? It isn't a wild pack, Drumheller. They move with unnatural purpose. They've been trained. They're being led. By 2 legs or 4? He asked, using the eagle's own terms. Bastion, he's not sure. Him and Anel, they're staying very high unless things here turn bloody. Is the pack closing? Not sure of that either. Strikes me, though, that these beasties are as patient as they are stubborn, holding off until maybe they're all gathered together. Very well trained, then. Why are they after the Daikini? Who says they are? They're just the one path. Thorn tweaked the side of his mouth, point to the wee folk yet again. The mayor can't defend himself, he said. That's the way of it sometimes, Bastion's voice sounded quietly in Thorn's head. Those who cannot fight and cannot flee. She deserves better, was his reply in kind, silent to all save the eagles. So do we all, agreed Bastion. How often are such entreaties granted? Her lucky night, then. That is so rude, declaimed Frangine. Bastion called me, Thorn tried to explain. It's rude to leave us out. If those poser pigeons say that to their face, want to talk to you, he wasn't fazed in the slightest by Thorn's challenge, any more than he was by the eagle's beaks or claws. They can fly right down and open their big beaks like decent folk. You don't see us using mind speak. No, Thorn thought, but thankfully kept his mouth shut. You're too in love with the sound of your own voices. Mind speech is too private. There'd be no audience for your wit. He sensed no direct awareness of the death dogs, but knew that meant nothing. They were bred to hide themselves from adepts of any kind, woodsmen, warriors, and magi. That, and their unbelievable ferocity, was what made them such fearsome hunters. The Daikini has to be warned, he told his companions, and stepped clear of the crack in the rocks that had been his hiding place. Though out of habit he moved as silently as he knew how, the moment Thorn stirred, the Daikini was out of his bedroll and into a combat crouch, drawn saber at full extension. It was a handsome blade. Thorn saw that right off, but as untested as the man who held it, without even the faintest taste of blood along its curved edge. Same went for the knife, at least as far as battle was concerned. It had slaughtered its share of dinner over time. Stay your distance, the Daikini challenged. You're being followed, Thorn overrode his words, his arms open, hands visible to reassure the warrior that he meant no harm. Them damn wolves again! The man rose to his full height. Thorn hated it. It guaranteed that even the most casual conversation would give him a cricked neck. He'd been assessed as a potential danger and dismissed. The warrior turned his focus to the preeminent threat. Took care of him the first time. Do the same again. As he spoke, the Daikini gathered up his crossbow. The weapon was built for cavalry use, an artful blend of power and portability. He braced it against one palm and pushed the cocking lever to draw the string to full extension before knocking a wedge-shaped broadhead bolt into place. The feathers would make the projectile spin as it shot through the air so it would strike its target like a corkscrew, allowing the barbed triple head to do the worst possible damage. As he worked, the Daikini shot Thorn a sideways glance, followed by a chuckle rich with self-mockery. Damn me, he said. Ain't it always the way? From your trail, small steps and all, Figured you was some youngin'. Got cut loose from the family. Figured maybe them damn wolves done for your folks. Figured I'd get to you first. But you're no kid at all, are you, Greybeard? Not for a good while, I'm sorry. Not to worry, little fella, the Daikini told him with a confident wave of his bow. One good hit's all the lovely needs. Broadhead bolts don't kill right off. It'll sure make the mark wish it had. All well and good, was Thorn's answer, though, assuming you get that hit, and assuming the death dog bothers to even notice. They didn't live as normal creatures, and Thorn knew from brute experience in no way died as them. Ones I tangled with figured 'em for outriders like, the Daikini continued. They were proper raiders, steady, dumb beasties. I'd call 'em scouts. One caught my girl a wicked slash against the rump. He patted his left leg. Damn near got me in the bargain. Pretty sure I did for him with a bolt. Pretty sure I did for 'em both. But my girl, she didn't want to stick about to make sure. Put the frighteners into her, they did. Never seen an animal run so fast. All I could do to keep my seat. Been walking her slow all day to make up for it. Got my doubts, though. Think she's broke. Not quite, thought Thorn. She's stronger than you know, but she's on the edge. Aloud, he said, They aren't wolves. He thought of casting wards, but didn't see the sense. The hounds would simply wriggle through the cracks in the energy fields, or worse, turn out to be immune. He'd seen both happen. Are they coming? He heard from Rule, accompanied by the click of Fang's swords being drawn from their scabbards. Thorn didn't reply, though he held a hand to forestall further questions. In memory was the image of the death dogs he'd killed. He tucked it around his spirit, pulling out the essence of the beasts in the same way he would a coat, dimly aware of the Daikini losing his own balance and tumbling away in startlement as a rolling cry burbled from somewhere below the bottom of Thorn's throat. The Nelwyn didn't need a mirror to know that his eyes were glowing, or that he'd turned a milky amber. He knew it was an illusion, but he still couldn't help reflexively tucking his tongue back into his mouth as his teeth appeared suddenly to grow much longer and a whole lot sharper in concert. His fingers flexed. That seemed to end now in wicked claws. His heart quickened to a drum-roll pace, this regrettably no fantasy, and felt every scrap of life about him, arrayed in his mind's eye as portions at a feast. With a swift, jerky motions, as though the commands were being issued to a wholly different body, he described a circle, right where he stood, surveying the campsite. The Daikini was scrambling to his feet, bow leveled, but Thorn ignored him as his mind filled with a score and more of ways to slaughter him. It wasn't a physical transformation, but a spiritual one. It wouldn't help him to detect the hounds. Instead, it allowed him for his brief while to think and feel as they did, to view the world through their eyes, and as a consequence, perhaps, anticipate their actions. The moon was occluded behind a scuddling line of clouds, turning the landscape light and dark in a random sequence, blurring further the distinction between what was and what was not. This was the time, he knew. The hour was right. The sky was right. The energies were right. Within a wrench, Thorn tore himself loose from his trance, tasting copper as he spoke from a slice taken out of the inside of his cheek by teeth that his thoughts were trying to manipulate as though they were in the mouth of the beast. They're here, he croaked, using the knowledge as a goad to bully himself into motion. He scrambled around the fire, making for the Daikini's mare, cursing the fact that his stinted legs forced him to take a score of frantic, waddling steps where the Daikini could have been there in two. He'd barely begun when the poor animal shrieked in terror and pain, but mostly he realized defiance, and he heard a solid thud as her rear hooves struck home. Knew that in that moment, as well that it had been her hooves that had done the damage during the initial encounter, not her rider's well-intentioned bow shots. A death dog sprang into view, charging straight up the slope, announcing its attack with the gobbling snarl that was their trademark. Part of the Daikini's equipment was a scabbard of short spears. Thorn pulled one free, slamming the butt home against the earth as he'd seen soldiers do in the face of an enemy charge, and used his own body to brace it in place. The hound twisted desperately in mid-air, bending itself worse than any cat, in gyrations that should have been impossible for any creature with a skeleton, and Thorn was swept by the sick surety that it would dodge him. Bastian swooped right then, throwing his wings wide to pull out of a tremendous dive. Then they struck the air with a resounding slap that Thorn felt as much as heard. It always amazed him that any living creature, even the eagles, could fall so far and fast and still survive. At the same time, Bastian lashed out at the dog with his claws. Not a fatal contact. The lunge was mostly to get the creature's attention. It worked. The death dog took a fatal snap at the attacker from above, even as Bastian muscled himself safely out of reach. A moment later, as it realized its mistake, it impaled itself on Thorn's spear. The beast still had life enough in it to make a try for Thorn, but as he was already pitching his spear sideways and the death dog with it into the heart of the bonfire. Across the way, the Dakini put a bolt in the breast of another, the force of the impact tumbling the beast onto its forelegs. Thorn was there before it could rise again, to hammer the point of another spear through its skull. "Your sword!" he bellowed at the Dakini. "Sever the head!" He wanted to tell the man to hurry, but it turned out there was no need. With a two-handed strike, the deed was done. The trooper's blade had taken the first life. A great hunt numbered 13. Thorn prayed they didn't face that many. If they did, they had no chance. 2 more exploded out of the darkness while he raced toward his own bedroll. He heard the tunk of the Daikini's bow, followed by the click-clack of the strike being cocked, and allowed himself a small marvel at the young man's poise. He stood his ground. He fought as he'd been trained, with a speed and accuracy that would do many veterans proud. Something bowled him over from behind, and he reflexively tucked arms and legs and head tight into his body, taking on the aspect of a hedgehog, to roll like a ball before the death dog's onslaught. He managed to catch it by the fur below the knob of its jaw, where his arms could hold its fangs clear of him. Its teeth sounded like metal as they crashed together, while it scrabbled for purchase with hind legs on the ground and forelegs on his tunic. Its breath made him gag. Its spittle burned like acid, and it splayed across his face. The creature was so intent on him that it didn't notice Rule working his way over the crown of its head until the brownie reared back, fangs swords in both hands to plunge them into his eyes. Maimed, the death dog sent everyone flying, lashing out in a frenzy even at its packmates. Thorn's questing hands found his own sword and brought it around to thrust it to the hilt down the shrieking hound's throat. He lost count how many they'd killed. The battle was so fierce and desperate he hardly had time to think, certainly none to plan. Every act, every move, every response had to flow from the one before, the parry that blocked one death dog becoming the lunge that slew another. Here and now, his size proved an invaluable asset. He met the pack on its own level, able to thrust straight on where the Daikini always had to stab downward. His short, strong arms could maneuver more quickly than the much larger man, and he was far more compact target. A yowl to the side announced one he'd missed as it collapsed onto its haunches with a severed hamstring. He didn't need to see the brownies to know they'd saved him yet again, but knew as well he'd be hearing about it the rest of his days. He used his sword to finish the job, then had to scramble for his life as the Daikini's mare reared so high over the brambles she'd been tethered to that she lost her balance and crashed full length onto her side. It was as though a mad painter had gone to work on her coat. She was splashed all over with blood. No color to the image, none to the entire scene. Only blotches and smears of glistening indigo under the moon's unblinking glow. There were 2 death dogs on her, one at the neck, the other scrambling for the belly to disembowel her. She'd made a magnificent effort for her life, and it would count for nothing. Thorn spun himself full circle to build up speed and let fly with his sword. He would have preferred another revolution or 2 for better effect, but the mare didn't have the time. The gleaming blade appeared to leave a trail through the air, a silver streak to match the light falling from above. The throw as straight and true as any javelin. It missed. The death dog saw it coming and got out of the way. Then it had to scramble as the mare lashed out with every leg arcing her back like an acrobat to regain her feet. The dog, trying for her throat, was taken by surprise. Like Thorn, it hadn't thought the mare had such resistance left in her, and found itself pitched into the air. This time, the eagles didn't pull away from their attack. bastion struck with the force of a battering ram, full to its spine, raking the death dog open to the bone. The creature let loose a horrible shriek as it found itself caught in mid-air and tossed even higher, spinning a lazy little circle to expose its belly. It knew what was coming, but there was nothing it could do. Nothing below its shoulders worked anymore. Thorn knew from a glance that it was dying. The fiery strictures of its life had been savaged as cruelly as its flesh. The eagles took no chances. The Nelwyn had his perceptions of death. They had theirs. They knew which to trust best. Anel stooped as quickly and powerfully as her mate, her own claws savaging the death dog from breast to hip, doing to it what had been intended for the mare. She ripped out of its heart and cast it on the fire. It was a magnificent sight. Thorn couldn't help watching. An almost fatal mistake. The hounds he'd missed come looking for retribution. The Daikini had problems of his own. He'd lost bow and sword and spears and was fending off a pair of attackers with a battle axe whose haft had broken. There was no sign of the brownies, but that came as no surprise. With all the bodies charging hither and yon, they'd go around until it was safe. The peril of being too small. The eagles weren't in view either, probably climbing back to altitude, which left him alone. He was close by the fire. He scooped up a brand, using a scrap of concentration to shunt the flames to the end of the wood and fan them to peak intensity. The death dog didn't mind, and actually seemed to appreciate the challenge. He wove the torch back and forth to keep the beast at a distance. It dodged the flames easily, once or twice offering a perfunctory snap of the teeth, but it wasn't trying to get him, merely hold his interest. It was as though Thorn's realization was a cue. The dog, facing the Daikini, made swift, twisting, diving moves, using all their fabled quickness and guile. One went for his throat, the other began racing full tilt for Thorn. The Daikini reacted with equally impressive speed. His foot booted the one trying for him, and with the same movement he threw himself after the other, extending his lanky form full length, casting the axe in a long overhand sweep that buried its head deep in the loamy soil. All he'd managed for his effort was to crop the tip of the hound's tail, but by doing so, he left himself wholly open to an attack. Thorn couldn't worry about that. He had problem enough. He charged a breath with a streamer of power, huffed it down the length of his torch, and flames exploded outward from the burning tip. This, his death dogs hadn't expected. One of them backpedaled furiously right into its charging fellow, the collision sending the pair of them into a tumble of legs and fangs. They'd recovered almost instantly and immediately took up the chase, for Thorn was on the run as fast as he could manage. Out of the campsite and across the boulder-strewn field, the ground sloped slightly upward and was furrowed in a random, messy pattern. A Daikini, or the death dogs, could streak right over the uneven terrain and hardly be slowed. Not so for Nelwyn's. His slim lead vanished with every step. His advantage was that he hadn't far to go, and that it was the near thing. The mountains sensed his approach. They wanted him still, more than ever. He was counting on that. He fed more power into the fire until the torch blazed so brightly in his grasp he had to narrow his eyes to slits to avoid being blinded. Another portion of power he used to mask this from the death dogs, only a half a dozen steps to the edge of the crater. He imagined he could feel their breath on his neck, and then it wasn't imagination any longer. They were on him. He spun in his tracks and pulled the hood that hid his torchlight, flashing the solar radiance full in the death dogs' slavering faces. At the same time, his next step hit empty air. He'd reached the scar. He let himself go, and the torch as well, thrusting out his hands to grab for purchase as he crashed down against the crater wall. The death dogs couldn't see, and were following so close behind that they were so bound up in the chase there was no chance to notice how he deceived them. Even if they had, there was nothing to be done about it. They'd been pushing themselves to the limit. Their leap took them a fair way beyond him, which in turn meant a fair fall to the steep slope of the crater. They landed well, and he knew they'd be after him again in a moment their feet touched the ground. His hope was that they'd have a hard time finding any sort of purchase on the wall. He needn't have worried. He hadn't forgotten the other forces at play here. He simply hadn't been sure they'd taken an interest. But with lights began flickering beneath the glassy surface, even before the death dogs landed, different hues, darker textures than before, the ones he remembered going after him. Those had been desire. These were hate. The mountains recognized a resonance for the power that had maimed them years before and took the opportunity to strike back with all their might. The hounds wailed their distresses, sensing what approached, and they tried to flee. Their desperate calls sounded like off-key horns. They made Thorn's nerves jangle, his heart lose rhythm within his chest, pounding too hard one set, not at all the next, and he quickly threw a calming pass over himself for protection. The smartest move would be to turn away, but he had to watch, partly in fascination, this infuriating, insatiable curiosity that he knew would probably be the death of him, partly to bear witness. The end was blindingly quick, yet every stage found itself printed indelibly on his memory. Between one step and the next, the death dogs turned from flesh to molten fire, retaining form and animation from a step farther until they cooled, and he beheld a pair of monstrously ugly statues. In the same heartbeat, their momentum caught up with them, all the impetus of their headlong flight shattering them to bits, as though they'd been struck by a hammer. Not a decent-sized pebble remained. They were reduced instantly to dust, which in turn was swept up and away by the same swirling winds and energies that had earlier entrapped Thorn. He felt breeze touch his bare face, then the nape of his neck, and he deliberately looked away, saw sparkles all across his field of vision at the mountains turned from what they destroyed to what they desired. He didn't have the strength to fight them, and knew they'd be no help from the Daikini, assuming the man was still alive. He heard a call, and set his face as he breathed a reply. "I can't," he said, though he wanted to, so easily, so tempting to take himself out of the game, to once more have focus and home, to spend his days at a simple, straightforward task, and never a need to worry about the consequences. A life without limits. "I won't." There was real sorrow in his voice, for himself as much as the mountains. "I'm pledged already," he went on. "You're not alone in this. Others have suffered as well, in equal measure." And all, he thought, cry out with equal force for vengeance. "I offer you what's rightfully due them, a chance for justice." He felt a tingle beneath his toes and a flush of true fear that they weren't going to take no for the answer. But the pressure of the weight slackened on his fingers as he found himself with a ledge to stand on and another just above it, making an easy climb up his body length and over the edge of the scar. He rolled to his seat, and from there stood wearily erect. Then he took a breath to gather himself and make a proper formal obeisance. He had been treated at the last with kindness and respect. He would do no less in return. That gesture just about finished him. He'd heard the stealthy pad of feet approaching from behind, but was so exhausted his brain hadn't processed the information. The sounds had no meaning until it was nearly too late. He didn't try anything fancy in response. He simply dropped and rolled, hoping to upend whoever was after him. This attacker walked on two legs and wasn't that much bigger than Thorn himself. Impressions noted in passing as Thorn thrust out a leg to act as pivot and brace and recovered his feet. He hadn't emerged unscathed. The other had taken a slash at him as he leaned over Thorn's tumbling body, leaving a burning trickle of dampness along the length of the Nelwyn's back, where the tip of the blade had cut him. It was a face Thorn knew, and the recognition of it almost got him killed a second time. "Farron," he called, more question than acknowledgement, because he truly didn't believe his eyes, though insight as well as out told him it was so. Then the knife flashed again for his heart this time, and there was no more opportunity for conscious thought. His body reacted as it had been trained to, one hand to block the thrusting blade, another to clutch the boy's tunic. Thorn's body giving way under the onslaught, feet presenting themselves to Farron's solar plexus as Thorn's backside touched the ground. The Nelwyn rolled onto its back, building speed as he went, pulling with his hand, pushing along the whole length of his legs, sending the boy into a flying somersault. Farron tried to land like a death dog on his feet and facing his foe, twisting himself in the air so wildly, Thorn wasn't sure he'd break his back, but he didn't have height or agility enough to succeed. His body hadn't yet grown sufficiently to fulfill those demands. All right, at 2-hour mark, that is where I'm going to stop. That is all the time I have today to read Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel and feel free to click the like button and share this video. Until the Infernal Brotherhood convenes again, my fellow scruffy-looking nerf herders, may the Force be with you.